Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first Streaming Science live electronic field trip. Streaming Science brings the science directly to you and your school through an interactive web broadcast. My name is Shelby Andersen, and I will be your host. Today, our program is all about ranches, rivers, and rats. If you have a question at any point, go ahead and submit them, and we will do our best to answer them. So I am an AESC major at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, which is Ag and Environmental Sciences Communication. I love being an Ag Communications major because I get to come out to places like this and interact with scientists like you're about to see. I grew up on a ranch south of Rushville, Nebraska, and graduated from Gordon Rushville High School. So shout out to the Gordon Rushville Mustangs that are watching right now. And hey, Mom and Dad. So behind the camera, we have Dr. Jamie Loizzo as our director. We have Emma Brindley-Buckley running our iPad right now. And finally, we have Mariah Lundgren that is manning the question booth. So with us right now, the schools that are watching are Lincoln Southwest High School, Pound Middle School, West Side Middle School, Gordon Rushville Middle School, Kearney High School, and Central City High School. So thanks for tuning in, guys. All right, with me now, we have Dr. Mary Harner and Dr. Keith Geluso. How are you guys?
Great.
Yes, it is a little chilly here today. So Mary, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hi, Shelby, and hi, everybody out there. My name's Mary, and I am a biologist, and specifically, I'm a biologist who studies rivers and streams and the aquatic organisms that live in and around these ecosystems.
All right, we're excited to hear about what you have to say. And Keith, can you tell us about yourself?
Hi, so I work at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, and there I have kind of two jobs. So one, I'm an educator and teacher, and so most of my time I spend teaching college students, but like today, sometimes I get the chance to educate and help out middle school and high school and sometimes even elementary schools. I am also a researcher and scientist, and so I get to go out and study animals in their natural environment. And so some of the animals I study, sometimes I study birds, and so I consider myself an ornithologist. Sometimes I study reptiles and amphibians, and so I am a herpetologist. Sometimes I even study the physiology of animals, and so I'm a physiologist. But mainly I am a mammalogist, and so this is usually a little eye-opening to people, but my favorite two groups of animals to study are bats and rats. And so you'll have an opportunity to see one of my little friends here today. And so most people think scientists and researchers only do experiments and experimental design, which I do some of, and it can be very challenging out in the field to do those types of experiments. However, I also do a number of projects where I study the natural history of animals, and so natural history is actually the description of natural things. And so if it hasn't been described before, I can go out and describe it, and that's part of my research. And so I can describe the distribution, the habitat, the diet, when these birds or bats or animals are hibernating, when they're migrating, when they're reproductive. And so I spend a lot of my time out in the field following these animals around.
It's great to be here with you guys, and you middle schoolers don't know how lucky you are to be hearing from these two scientists today. Can we start by having you two give a little background into the ranch that we are at today?
We're here at the Switzer Ranch, and we're in central Nebraska in the Sandhills. And the Switzer Ranch is about 3.5 hours northwest of Lincoln and about 2 hours straight north of Kearney. This is a working cattle ranch, and the family who lives here also runs a nature-based tourism business. And so through that business, they bring people here to take tours through the prairies and the grasslands, also guided hunting trips and trips down the Calamus River, which is just to our south here. So this is a ranch that serves many purposes, and the family who lives here works very hard to take care of the land so that it serves needs for many generations to come, but they also make their lands open and available to people like us to come and learn and share information about ranches.
So to understand the research that these two are doing, we need to know a little bit more about what ranches are and what the Sandhills are. So a ranch is a business that raises cattle, and most ranches in Nebraska are family businesses. So that means that everybody chips in. I grew up on a family ranch, and so I started working when I was very young. The work that these families do to raise cattle feeds people all around the world. So they're great operations, and we need to keep them around. Mary, can you tell us a little more about the family that lives here?
So the Switzer family, ancestors of the Switzer family, homesteaded this area well over 100 years ago in the early 1900s. And currently there are 3 generations of that family who live and operate this ranch. And as I mentioned before, along with running this large ranch, they also open their land to a lot of visitors.
That's great. The Sandhills are perfect for ranching because cattle eat grass, and as you can see, there's plenty of grass out here. But that wasn't always the case. The Sandhills used to be giant hills of just sand, and over time, grass gradually grew on them, and they stabilized the sand so that it wasn't just blowing all over the place. So, Keith, tell us a little bit more about the Sandhills.
All right, so when you think of Nebraska, I suspect you think of corn or the corn huskers. And so if you drive along I-80 or along the Platte River, you see lots of agricultural fields that are helping to supply food for North Americans as well as the whole entire world. But many of you may not know that 1/4, 25% of the state of Nebraska is covered by these rolling hills of sand. In the past, as Shelby mentioned, they were not as well covered with sand, with vegetation, and there's more blowing sand. And if you've ever been to a beach and experienced walking on sand, it can be very difficult because the sand moves underneath your feet. And so we'll talk about some adaptations that some of the animals have out here to actually try to live in these sandhills. Sandhills can be 400 feet tall. Some of these dunes can last or measure 20 miles long. And so there's actually a variety of different habitats on these sand dunes. Some of the plants out here include a lot of grasses, and so we have things such as sand bluestem. A little bit on the lower elevations we have some switchgrass as well as some big bluestem. There's also lots of little bluestem. There are also some flowering plants out here. So there's actually some native roses. There's some sunflowers, many different species that actually provide lots of food for my little rats and other animals out here. There's one species of plant that's only found in the Nebraska Sandhills, and that's called blowout penstemon. I think we have a picture by Mariah from the Nebraska National Forest where they're trying to reestablish some. Blowout penstemon is an endemic species, so that means it only is found in a specific place in the world, and the only place that it's found is here in the Nebraska Sandhills in places with open sand. So there are actually lots of different habitats. Blowouts are where these blowout penstemon occur, as well as some of my favorite animals to study, kangaroo rats, which we'll get to in a little bit.
All right, we're going to take a break for questions in a little bit, so if you have any, go ahead and submit them, and we'll do our best to answer them. Before we do that, Mary, can you explain why you selected this ranch as your research site and some of the technology that you use?
So we work a lot with a project called the Platte Basin Time-Lapse Project, and one of the core parts of the Time-Lapse Project is a network of 50 cameras that are distributed across the Platte River Basin. And the Platte River Basin covers a lot of Nebraska, and it has its headwaters in Colorado and Wyoming. And one of those cameras is just a few hundred feet down this creek from us, and these cameras take a picture every hour of daylight hour, and some have been running for more than 5 years. So one of the reasons that we picked this as our research site is that there are 3 of these long-term cameras that are taking pictures. This one and then 2 to the north of us that are farther into the Sandhills. And so there's a rich history of long-term photography and visual data, and there are also there's a lot of support and accommodations that make it a convenient place to meet and for teams like us to spend a few days out here in the field.
All right, so we are ready for some questions. Do you have some questions that some kids have brought us?
Yes, we have a couple questions. First question is, why is that penstemon only found in the Nebraska Sandhills?
My hypothesis would be is because it's one of the only places where the certain conditions, the environment, the rainfall, are come together where this one species is adapted. Good question of why it doesn't occur on some of those sandhills that I used to play out in Nevada and New Mexico, but probably again the precipitation enables it to survive out here as well as the right type of soil conditions. So, good question.
And then Lily from Pound wants to know, what is your favorite type of bat?
Oh, I have a very favorite type of bat. It's called a spotted bat. And so it has they're about this big. The ears are that big, but the bat's not much bigger. And so if you can Google that, they're extremely crazy cool. 3 big white spots on the back. They're a black bat, and they live on sheer faces of cliffs. And so actually very hard to capture, but I'm one of the few biologists that have captured them regularly and published at least 3 papers on them so far.
Where do they live?
Where do they live? In New Mexico, in the western part of North America. So, yeah, about 13 different states.
One more question. What encouraged you to do this live streaming with high school and middle school students?
We want you all to get to see this beautiful place, and we'd love to be able to bring everybody out by the busload, but sometimes that's not feasible for a number of reasons. And so while this isn't a substitute, we hope that you get to experience a little bit of what it feels like to be out here, and maybe sometime if you're driving across Nebraska or planning a trip, you can plan to come somewhere like this, and when you're here, you'll know a little bit more about it. So our main goal is we want to share places like this with you.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Will we get to see a kangaroo rat later?
Yes, we will get to see a kangaroo rat later because there's one right here, and I've got a few more in a trap that we can pull out and take a look at some of their characteristics or adaptations for actually living on the sand and dry and desert environments.
All right, perfect. So now that we've covered some of the introductions and some history and background of where we are today, we get to do the really cool stuff now and get to talk about really awesome stuff, science. So Mary mentioned that she studies water, but when we look around where we're at today, we see a stream, but we don't really see much water anywhere else. So how do you study what you can't necessarily see?
So here in the Sandhills, we're surrounded by a lot of sand, a lot of hills, and it's a very, very dry place on the surface. But a lot of the water is beneath us, right beneath our feet. And so that's one of the really fascinating parts of this area is how that groundwater interacts with the soil and with the surface water. And so we're here on top of the Ogallala Aquifer, and that aquifer and other shallow groundwater feeds streams like Gracie Creek and lakes, and it provides a really neat combination of dry, very arid habitats that animals like the kangaroo rat like to inhabit that are very close to places like the stream that are wet year-round, that are important habitat for a lot of aquatic organisms. So there's a really neat mixture of habitats and associated biodiversity here.
Yeah, the High Plains Aquifer, otherwise known as the Ogallala Aquifer, is really cool. Can you tell us a little more about that?
So many of you have probably already learned about the Ogallala Aquifer in school, but it extends all the way from South Dakota down to Texas. But Nebraska is a special part of that aquifer system because we have a lot of groundwater that remains in the aquifer here in Nebraska. And so in many places, like where we are today, that water is close to the surface, and it sustains water like that's found in the Sandhill lakes and some of these headwater streams that feed other river systems.
Now, I remember learning about the water cycle in school, so can you give us an overview of that?
Well, I'm hoping that the water cycle doesn't enter the rain phase while we're out here because we have a lot of cameras and iPads and things. But you've learned about the water cycle in school and the kind of the continuous cycling of water. But what's really special here in the Sandhills is how water that is cycling interacts with the ground. And so we have up above us clouds, And oftentimes those clouds will produce precipitation that fall to the ground as rain, or in the winter, snow. And that precipitation can percolate through the sand dunes and go straight down through that sand into the spaces between rocks and soil in the ground and enter the groundwater. Or that rainwater or snow can melt and roll off and enter the surface flow. But either way, it does what's called recharge the aquifer, or the groundwater. So the water that's beneath us in between spaces in the ground, as that water comes in, can fill up, and what's known as the water table, the upper surface of the groundwater, can rise closer to the surface. And sometimes that water can rise until it's almost right where our feet are on the ground, or it can intersect depressions, like where the stream flows, or lake bottoms, and fill streams and lakes. And so really key part of the water cycle here is that the water is moving not just above ground and through the air, but it's connected to what's underneath our feet. When the sun comes up and the energy of that sun is here, water evaporates, and it can evaporate from the ground surface, from open water, and the water can also transpire and move up through plants. And so with that energy of the sun, water moves back out of the system and back into the atmosphere, and the cycle begins again. But a really key part of what's happening here is the interaction with the groundwater here in the Sandhills.
So why is it so important to understand the water cycle here in the Sandhills?
Well, it's important to understand the water cycle anywhere. We are all made up of water. All life depends on water, and we are all connected by water. And so by understanding how these cycles work at different scales, whether that be talking about this place or talking about our whole country or at the scale of the whole world, it helps us understand how life is connected and how decisions that we make have effects on all other parts of the system.
Can you tell me more about how the changing levels of the groundwater and surface water affects the Sandhills?
So the groundwater here is very close to the surface, and so little changes can change how much water is available to plants or that's available to feed lakes. So for example, if the groundwater drops just a tiny bit, the water level drops, and the plants need to spend more energy growing their roots to stay connected to moist soil. And everything's in constant balance and trade-offs. And so when a plant is growing more energy using more energy to grow down, is energy that it's not using to make more green parts of the plant. And so if the water levels drop too much and it gets too dry, there's less vegetation for livestock like cattle and some of the native species who live here to feed upon. Conversely, sometimes when the water table and the groundwater is really close to the surface, that helps make plants really, really productive and grow a lot. And so in between these sandhill dunes are valleys, and those valleys are often sub-irrigated wet meadows, and they produce a lot of grass and other vegetation that can be hayed and used to in turn feed livestock. And those wet meadows also support a lot of other species, such as some rare orchids and some native prairie birds.
Now, I know that you've been doing research on this creek that's running right next to us. Can you tell me about where it comes from and then where it goes after this?
So water here in the Sandhills can come from precipitation, like rain and snow, but a lot of it's coming right out of the ground. And so this particular creek, most of the water that we see here is erupting out of the ground as springs and flowing into this stream. The stream is a tributary of the Calamus River, so just a few miles down the road here it joins the Calamus River, and then the Calamus River eventually joins the Platte River. So this stream is what we consider to be a headwater stream of the Platte River. And eventually the Platte River flows to the Missouri, which flows to the Mississippi and on to the Gulf of Mexico. And so a drop of water here could potentially end up all the way in the Gulf of Mexico, again showing how we're all connected by water.
So can we get into the research that you're doing?
So I study a lot of different aspects about streams and rivers, but one of the main things that I study is how water interacts with the landscape through which it flows, including how groundwater and surface water interact, and how that influences the habitat for a lot of species. So that includes habitats in the water. So streams like this have a lot of insects, for example, that live within those waters, and those insects grow up in these waters, and then they emerge and they feed food webs all around us on the terrestrial side. But I also study how water changes over time. So water levels can change seasonally, just depending on how much it rains. They can also change over much longer timescales, like decadal timescales, depending on larger scale climate dynamics. So for that work, we use a combination of historical aerial photography and also the kinds of images that our time-lapse cameras are capturing to look at how water changes on the landscape over time and in turn influences the amount of habitat that's available for a wide range of organisms who live here.
All right, and I know you also study along streams. Tell me about that research specifically.
So some of our stream work focuses on what we call our ecotones, the edges between the water and the land. And so a lot of my work is focused on the ecology of cottonwood trees, which there's one here, it hasn't leafed out above us, but how the leaves and things that fall from these trees feed aquatic food webs, and in turn how nutrient-rich water from rivers and streams feeds the root systems and helps support the productivity and diversity of those riparian forests.
So I know that when Mary and I were talking the other day about this stream, she told me another really interesting fact that I like is that this stream stays open even in the winter when it's freezing outside. The water in the stream is still running, and so cattle can drink out of this water year-round, and I think that's really neat, a really nice source of water for animals. Can you tell me what your favorite part is about conducting research?
We're doing one of my favorite parts right now. So we're out here with researchers from the University of Nebraska-Kearney, from University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and other partners, and it's a mix of professors and students and colleagues, and I love getting to work with big teams of people. I'm a scientist, but a lot of my work is with people who are not scientists, photographers and artists and writers, and I love getting to work with big teams of people to answer questions and to share what we find. And I really like the observation phase of science, coming to a new place, looking around, taking observations, making hypotheses, and then designing projects to help answer questions that emerge from those observations.
All right, that's really cool. So now we're going to do some more questions. So what questions do we have coming in here, Mariah?
So a really popular question is, with grazing cattle, the primary industry in the Sandhills, how does your research impact or affect that?
I will talk a little bit about plant-animal interactions coming up, and so we're going to find out that these kangaroo rats actually are helping to plant some of the grasses and the forbs, the flowering plants out here. So some of the forage of the cattle are actually related to my small mammals.
Another question is, the Ogallala Aquifer in danger of running out?
So we always have to be careful with our water resources. Aquifers recharge very slowly, and so people need to be careful as they pull water out to do that at a slower rate than it takes to recharge, so that it stays in balance. So there are lots of places in the around the Ogallala Aquifer where it is in danger of being depleted. The groundwater reserves here are still fairly secure, but it's something that we really need to be careful and protect throughout the entire range of the aquifer system.
You answer in Texas, right? You talk about the Ogallala Aquifer in Texas?
Yeah, they're particularly in the southern parts of the distribution of the aquifer in North America. It's dropping quite a bit, and a lot of wetland systems that are reliant on that source of groundwater are being altered very severely because of the decline in groundwater levels.
And then Ethan from Pound wants to know, how long have you had the cameras up?
cameras were put in place by colleagues of ours, Michael Forsberg and Mike Farrell and their team, and some of the cameras have been running in the system since spring of 2011. So we have a pretty long-term record already. And all of the cameras are available to watch and view at flatbasintimelapse.com if you want to take a look at any particular one.
And then another question, does flooding ever occur in the Sandhills?
All the time. I haven't had the fortune to see it happen here, but landowners who live here have talked about this creek flooding almost all the way over to the base of that tree line. So sometimes large volumes of water come through here. The lakes are sometimes completely dry, and then sometimes they are filled all the way to their edges and overflow and lead to overflow that feeds other creeks. And so yes, it can be very, very wet. Here, right now, we're here kind of at an in-between time. The roads are wet. We were having a hard time navigating some of the areas, but there's not a lot of widespread flooding right now.
Perfect. So now we're going to get into the rat portion of our presentation. So Keith, you're a biologist. Can you tell us about your work?
Well, first I want to say that I'm a Nebraskan and I grew up in Omaha, and so I actually graduated from Westside. So hello to all the Westsiders out there. So I grew up in Nebraska, and a lot of the times in the summer and the fall, I'm a bird watcher. I go out and fish and do a little hunting, and so we go out to the Nebraska Sandhills. So first of all, why do I study in the Sandhills? Because I've been imprinted on this area, and it's absolutely beautiful. So the Sandhills represent one of the largest, or the largest intact mid-grass to tall grass prairie still left in North America. So I love studying animals in their native environments and still where it looks relatively natural. So some of the projects we've got going on out here, we're going to start a brand new project shortly that actually combines the groundwater, the ranching, which we're going to look at stock tanks and windmills, and then we're going to see the diversity of wildlife that comes to these windmills at different times of the year. We're going to compare which ones actually drink from the tanks and from the overflow ponds, and then we'll also have a camera out in the Sandhills a certain distance away just to have a relative amount of how many more individuals are coming to these tanks. So that's when we're going to start off pretty soon, and I always just like finding out what species are here, because if we don't know what species are here, it's hard to ask questions. And so once we know it's here, we can ask different types of questions. Another major topic that I like to study is how humans have changed landscapes and what are the responses of the animals. And so the Sandhills, as we've talked about, should be covered mainly with grasses and small plants and forbs and flowering plants. But if you look around us, actually at this site right here, you can see a lot of eastern red cedars. And so these were planted by ranchers originally for windbreaks. They've also planted these as a quick source of making fence posts, because once they started fencing off the prairie, they needed a source of wood, which there's not much out here. But now some of these eastern red cedars are spreading. They're invasive. They're not native to the Sandhills. And as driving up here yesterday, there's huge patches now of eastern red cedars. And so another question I ask is, how are the mammals responding to these woodlands that are now out here that weren't out here before? And so that's another one of the major questions.
All right, so what does it mean to study ecology?
All right, ecology. Ecology is the interactions between different components of an ecosystem. So interrelationships, interactions. Predator-prey would be a great example. A pollination, the bee pollinates the flower. Those are both examples of ecology. So again, interrelationships, interactions, and there can be at different levels. So at the community level, looking at different things that are living, we just gave you some examples, but we can also figure out how does nitrogen get into these systems, which all of us depend to make proteins, and so that would be at the ecosystem level.
And why did you choose to study kangaroo rats?
Kangaroo Rats are, first of all, they're just cute. So we'll get some close-up visions of pictures of these. Their names, and they're extremely fascinating mammals. They have lots of adaptations that we'll talk about here, some of them that enable them to do and survive really well out here in the sandy substrates of parts of the sandhills, and especially the blowouts. And so one of the major types of studies that I like to do are plant-animal interactions. Again, it gives us a broader scope of why we're out here. And so I like, yeah, they're amazing animals. They're named Kangaroo Rats. They have a huge long tail, 2 big feet, and they actually hop around. And so they need open areas. They're bipedal. That means they're using 2 feet. Most of the rats and mice and squirrels you think of are quadrupedal, so they're moving around on all 4s. But the kangaroo rats are extremely fast. They can jump really high. And you might even see a video here linked, or you can go to Platte Basin Time-Lapse and see some interactions. They're very highly territorial, and so they actually spar off and use their feet to kick other individuals out of their territory.
And I know that you use traps to capture these animals and study them and learn about their characteristics. Can you show us how those work?
Magically, I have one.
Weird.
How does that happen? So here is a Sherman live trap. They come in different styles, different lengths. This is a collapsible one, so I just popped it open. There's a front door to it, and here's a door. There's a little latch down there that the door goes underneath. Okay, let me open this up a little bit so I can try something here. All right, so when I set these traps, I usually carry a box of 40 because that's how I buy them, in a nice convenient box. And I set trap lines or grids. I'll put some seeds in the very front of it and throw seeds all the way to the back of the trap. Okay, so when an animal then smells or detects the seeds, it'll come in, walk in. If we get it to go all the way to the back of the trap, it'll step on this treadle, and the trap goes off. And so these are, again, are live traps. It's a very efficient way of catching small mammals. All right. Is there more questions to ask? I think
Well, now I think we're really excited to see a rat. Do you have one with you?
I do. I went out last night and caught a couple of them. So we have one in a cage, but I'll also show another one here. And so we'll take a look at some of their adaptations. We'll be right back.
Okay, perfect. So while Keith is getting that rat, you can send us some questions. We might be able to answer some real quick. These animals are really fun to look at, so you guys are in for a treat.
All right, so one of the easiest ways to get kangaroo rats and other mice out of these Sherman live traps are real fancy, expensive equipment here. So I've got a Ziploc bag or any plastic bag. Let me open this up a little bit. My hands are a little cold. They're not functioning as they should. All right, let's see who we have in here. So when I go trapping, it's like Christmas. Every closed door, I don't know what's in those traps. And sometimes it's not mammals. Sometimes I've had rattlesnakes, I've had lizards, I've had scorpions, I've had tarantulas. But all right, let's see if I don't lose this little guy jumping around. All right, so again, notice big hind feet and the big long tail. They can jump a couple feet high. They can actually they can change their direction in air as they're jumping. They use that tail also as a rudder. He's all right. Let's see if we can take this guy out. I want to show you some features about its face and head, as well as its feet, to be adapted for living out in the dry environments. So I'm going to scoot him up here to the top. He's not going to like this too much because I am a big animal and he thinks I'm going to eat them, but I am not going to harm him. So I'm just going to take him out here for just a brief moment. So we can take a look at his feet. So one of the adaptations, if you look at the feet, the bottom of the feet of most mice, they are naked. But these are completely furred on the bottom. And so it's like a big snowshoe hare. So it's allowing for more surface area, so it makes it easier to move along the sand. Okay. This is a boy. We have the testes are right there. We can see them. So he's probably sexually mature right now and trying to breed and reproduce. The heads of kangaroo rats are also very big. In the back of their head, they have something called auditory bulla, which are really enlarged, and so they can hear low-frequency sounds. So a lot of the predators of kangaroo rats are owls and coyotes, and so they can supposedly hear the wing beats of these low-frequency sounds. But when I do the owl pellet checks and look and see what the owls have been eating in the area, they've eaten a lot of my kangaroo rats. So let's also take a look at. So when most, let me put this guy in the bag and then I'll come back and pull this guy out in just a second here. Hang on. So when most mice that are seed lovers, granivores, take seeds from the environment, they actually literally stick them in their mouth. And so seeds are dry, and one of the attributes of seeds is they're hydrophilic, water-loving, so then they can absorb water, so then they can germinate. And so if you're a desert or dry species of animal that handles a lot of seeds, if you put them in your mouth with the saliva, you're going to actually lose a lot of your body water, which you need to conserve in dry areas. Kangaroo rats and some of their closest alloys, pocket mice, kangaroo mice, also have an adaptation called an external fur-lined cheek pouch. And so I'm going to demonstrate it here, but we're going to hopefully see it. They actually have an extra flap of skin on their face that's completely fur-lined. So if I take a seed from, or he takes a seed from the environment and sticks it in his cheek pouch, it has nothing to do with water. And so those animals are, again, an adaptation for living in dry desert environments, or grasslands are the next step up from deserts. All right, so let's see if we can see that external fur-lined cheek pouch. And they can store some pictures, lots and lots of seeds in them. Come on up to the top. All right, let's see if we can see. You can see the teeth, and that's where you can barely see where the mouth is, but I can open that up. Look how big of an area. Can we zoom in on that maybe, or show that external fur-lined cheek pouch there? So again, they can store lots and lots of seeds. Mary and I actually hypothesized that there might be some mycorrhizal fungi in there that inoculate, that enable those seeds to germinate and do better when they're growing in the soil. So this might be a carrier. Again, looking at those plant-animal interactions, the kangaroo rats. So again, let me put this guy in here again. So let me talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done out here. A lot of times these animals, you think these are going to be bad for the plants. Every time they eat a seed, that's the death of the plant. And so we have studied, a colleague of mine, Jeremy White at the University of Nebraska-Omaha, and I have put out yucca seeds and watched what these kangaroo rats do with them. In the wintertime, they take them, they put them in their cheek pouches, and then take them all into their burrow. And that's the death of all of those seeds. However, in the summer, we found out kind of an interesting switch in behaviors, which they weren't supposed to do in the literature, so that was kind of one of our novel findings. In the summer, they actually take small groups of those seeds and literally scatter them in their territory. They're called scatter hordes. And so sometimes they don't always come back and find the seeds, or we've also done some experiments when they come and find them again, they're sloppy. They leave one or two seeds behind. And so then those are the seeds for the next generation of plants out here in the environment. So again, I like these plant-animal interactions, which then helps show and grow the vegetation out here on these sandhills. So.
All right. Well, that was really educational. I like seeing this little guy. He's cute. If anybody has any questions, do we want to go to that? Do some questions? All right.
So, one of the questions, I'll wait till the rat is safely back in its trap. How common are kangaroo rats?
Very common. There are a number of different species across the deserts and grasslands of North America. We only have one species in Nebraska, but if it's sandy, pretty much the entire state except for the eastern quarter, if there's sandy habitat, there's a high likelihood there's kangaroo rats, and they can be very abundant. I set 20 traps last night, and 4 of those traps had kangaroo rats. There's 1 deer mouse. So one of the most common species out here in the sandhills with open sand.
Okay. a really popular question by Jackson is, do they have to drink water?
That is an excellent question, and so actually not. They do not have to actually drink water, but so you say, well, everybody needs water to survive. So they eat the seeds that they process, and in that process of cellular respiration, I know we might be going a little too deep and you don't want to go there, but they actually make what they call metabolic water, and so they can actually, if they eat certain types of vegetation and seeds, make enough. And so they'll actually avoid eating plants and seeds, so sunflowers are some of these, that have high amounts of nitrogen, because if they have high nitrogen when they go through this process of cellular respiration, they get rid of that and they have to pee it out, and so they're losing some water there. But they have really concentrated urine, and so yes, they don't have to drink free water, but if it's available, I suspect they do. Of course, we need to get some video of that.
Enrique from Pound wants to know, how big do kangaroo rats grow up to be, or how big can they get?
All right, so the one I had today was full size, so maybe the size of my fist. There are kangaroo rats out there, the banner-tail kangaroo rat and the giant kangaroo rat that lives in the Central Valley of California get to be even bigger. So not huge, but maybe twice the size of my hand, maybe up to 3 times. I have not actually seen that species. There's a lot in Central Valley of California that are endangered and threatened because their habitat has been lost throughout the years. But this is one of the smaller sized kangaroo rats.
And I'm going to change the topic just a little bit, but Holly from Lincoln Southwest wants to know, how are the seeds different in the Penstemon from other plants?
Here's the real answer. I have not even seen a blowout Penstemon in all of my work in the Sandhills, so my colleague and I have thought about trying to have a study with blowout Penstemon to see how kangaroo rats handle them, but because of their rarity, we decided not to try to do that project. So I don't know what they look like.
Another very popular question is, what percentage of the Sandhills are ungrazed and unirrigated prairie?
A good question that I don't know if I'll be able to answer. There are some, if you look at Google Earth and zoom in, you can see not lots, but some of the valleys have center pivots. So that would be some of the irrigated land, but most of it I would think is not irrigated. And I would think almost all of it is grazed by different types of livestock. So mainly cattle, but I know of a few ranches that definitely run bison out there. There was one piece of property on the Nebraska National Forest at Halsey that they actually left as a quote natural area where they didn't allow grazing, which goes against what I think of what natural is in the grasslands. And there were lots of shrubs, lots of super dense grasses, and I set some traps in that habitat because I was really curious to see, and there are very few species. And so my kangaroo rats, pocket mice, and deer mice that are really common in the Sandhills, they need the disturbance by cattle or by bison to create open areas with sand. And if it gets too dense, those species will become rarer. And there'll be some other species in the places that are really thick. The voles, the harvest mice become really common in places where there's dense grass. So I think most of it is being grazed. And if not, it's being grazed or browsed by deer and elk and other places.
Okay, here's a fun question by Jake. Are kangaroo rats distantly related to kangaroos at all?
Well, very distantly, they're all mammals. So all mammals have hair. They all produce milk for nourishment of their young. But kangaroos are marsupials, and so marsupials have a different way of reproduction. The kangaroo rats are placental mammals, and so there's a placenta that joins between the embryo and the mother for the connection to get blood and oxygen, and get rid of CO2 and get some of the nutrients in. So we're all mammals are related, but the difference between placentals and marsupials are quite a long time split in evolutionary history of mammals.
And then I think we have time for one more question. Ethan from Pound wants to know, how long have you guys been scientists?
I'm going to let Mary start.
I think in some way all my life. I grew up on a river, and since I was a little kid, watched and observed rivers, and some of that early observation still informs how I think about things today. But I went to college for 4 years and obtained a bachelor's degree, and then went to college for 2.5 more years for a master's degree, and then after that 5 more years for a doctorate, and then did what's called a postdoc for about 1.5 years after that. So my formal education as a scientist went for a long time, and I've been working here in Nebraska for just over 10 years.
Good question. I have the unique fortune that my father was also a researcher and a professor at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and so very early on I was exposed to natural environments across mainly the western parts of the United States, and so I have been trapping and catching bats and rats since I was at least 5 years old, because I have photographic evidence of it. So people say that they're jealous or envious of me because I've always known what I wanted to be. I wanted to do this as a career and be outside as much as I can.
All right, so thank you everybody for tuning in. This is the end of our program. If you go to our website, streamingscience.com or plattbasintimelapse.com, we have more material, more videos, more photos, and you should definitely go check that out in your classroom or back at home. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We had a great time. Hope you did too. See you next time. Bye.